Chapter 5 A New Home. Mrs. Lawson would not let the puppies leave their mother until they were 6 weeks old, but she told Mandy and James they could come and see their puppy as often as they'd like. Mr. Hunter took Mandy and James to see him every week. The puppy opened his eyes when he was 10 days old, and by the end of the second week, he was beginning to cut his first teeth. James could hardly wait to get him home. "I know what I'm going to call him," he said at the end of their second visit. "What?" said Mandy. "Blackie," James said. Mandy looked down at the little black bundle of fur. "That's perfect, James," she said. Mr. Hunter smiled. "That's a good name," he said. "You'll need to get him used to it as soon as possible." "That's true," Mrs. Lawson said. "It's never too early to get a puppy used to his name. Try it out on him now, James." James bent down and tickled his puppy under the chin. The little dog yawned and looked up at him sleepily. "Hello, Blackie," James said. "How do you like your name?" Blackie yawned again and snuggled closer to his mother. His eyes closed. "He went back to sleep again," said Mandy. "Maybe you should call him Sleepy," Mr. Hunter joked. James shook his head. "I've made up my mind," he said. "He's Blackie." When it was time for Blackie to leave his mother, Dr. Adam took Mandy and James to get him. Dr. Adam was going to check on all the puppies before they went off to their new owners. Mrs. Lawson had put the puppies in a playpen. They rolled around, chasing one another and having pretend fights. Dr. Adam looked at the little animals tumbling around. "Which one is yours, James?" he said. James pointed Blackie out, and Dr. Adam watched the puppy for a moment. "He looks like a good one," he said. "Look how he's playing with the others. He's got plenty of confidence, but he isn't aggressive. He's a fine, lively puppy." "Have you got owners for all of them, Mrs. Lawson?" Mandy said. Mrs. Lawson nodded. "All the ones I'm selling," she said. "I had no trouble finding good homes for them. Let me get yours for you, James." She bent down to pick up a puppy. "Not that one, Mrs. Lawson," Mandy called out. "That isn't James's." James came to look. "No," he said. "There's mine, the little one." My, Mrs. Lawson said. "You're right, of course. This one is Sarah's. How silly of me." She picked up James's puppy and looked at him. "These two are very alike," she said. "James's puppy really has grown a lot," said Mandy. "But he's still a little smaller," said James. "I would know your puppy anywhere, James," Mandy said. "Blackie's got such a nice look in his eyes. He's so friendly." Mrs. Lawson laughed. "You're very observant, Mandy," she said. "I'm glad I didn't get these two mixed up." James held out his arms, and Mrs. Lawson gave him the puppy. The little animal squeaked and looked up at his new owner. His tiny pink tongue came out, and he licked James's hand. James looked at Mandy. "I can't believe it," he said. "My very own puppy!" Mandy put out a hand and stroked the puppy's soft coat. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "The nicest of the litter." Dr. Adam looked at Blackie. "You know, I think you're right, Mandy," he said. "Look how easily he lets James handle him. And see the way he's looking back at James? That's the mark of a confident animal." James cradled Blackie in the crook of his arm. "He's so good-natured," he said. Dr. Adam nodded. "Turn him on his back, James," he said. "Let's see how he reacts." James turned Blackie over. The puppy squirmed a little and then lay contentedly in James's arms. "There you see," said Dr. Adam. "That's what you're looking for in a puppy. A bit of a struggle, and then he settles down quickly. I'd say you've got a fine puppy there, James." "Of course he has," Mandy said. "All Molly's puppies are wonderful, aren't they, girl?" She turned down to look at Molly. The Labrador looked up at her with sad eyes. "Oh, Molly," Mandy said, "you're going to miss your puppies, aren't you?" Mrs. Lawson gave Molly a pat. "I'm keeping one of the puppies to breed from," she said, "so Molly won't lose all of her family." Mandy smiled. It was good to think of Molly still having one of her puppies to look after. Mr. and Mrs. Hunter were waiting eagerly for them to arrive home with the puppy. I've got his bed all ready, said Mrs. Hunter. Bring him straight into the kitchen. Mandy followed James and Blackie into the kitchen. There were newspapers spread out over the kitchen floor. Just in case of accidents, Mrs. Hunter said. Dr. Adam nodded. Very wise, he said. You can't always get a puppy of that age outside in time. Mandy looked at the dog basket in the corner of the room. There was a cardboard box inside of it. What's that for? She said. The dog basket is too big for him at the moment, Mrs. Hunter said. But if we put him in a box inside the basket, then he'll get used to it. That's a good idea, said Mandy. And I put an old blanket in the bottom of the box, said James, so Blackie will be really cozy. If he misses his mother, you could put a hot water bottle in beside him, said Dr. Adam, but make sure it has a cover on it. James nodded. I'll do that, he said. I'm sure Blackie will miss Molly. Blackie looked up at him and gave a soft little growl. Did you hear that? Said James. I think he knows his name already. Maybe he's hungry, said Mandy. Mrs. Lawson said we should give him something to eat when we get him home. Dr. Adam looked at his watch. I must get back to the clinic, he said. Give something to eat now, James. Some warm milk with cereal and grated vegetables should do, and don't forget to take him outside immediately afterwards. House training can't begin too soon. Can Mandy stay for dinner? James asked. Dr. Adam and the Hunters looked at one another. I don't think I could drag her away if I wanted to, said Dr. Adam, laughing. Mrs. Hunter looked at Mandy. She and James were already gathering things together for Blackie's feed. Something tells me you aren't going to see too much of Mandy for a while, she said to Dr. Adam.